she would get on the phone and somehow get into my contacts and send obscene messages to random people.
At 75 years old, Don Johnson finally said what many suspected but never thought he would admit. For decades, his marriage to Melanie Griffith was painted as a Hollywood whirlwind: passion, breakups, reconciliations, and the chaos of fame. To the outside world, they were the glamorous couple who could not stay apart. Yet behind the cameras, their love story was steeped in addiction, heartbreak, and secrets neither of them ever dared to share. Now, after a lifetime of silence, Johnson has revealed the devastating truth about what really went on between them. It is not the fairy tale fans imagined, and it reshapes everything we thought we knew about one of Hollywood's most dramatic romances. What he confessed has left fans stunned, and it raises the question of whether love was ever enough to hold them together. The story of Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith begins with a level of intensity that very few relationships could survive. Melanie was only 14 years old when she first crossed paths with Johnson, who was already 22 and chasing stardom in Hollywood. Her mother, actress Tippi Hedren, was a celebrated figure thanks to her iconic role in Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. It was through her circle that Melanie encountered Johnson for the first time. To the outside world, their meeting may have seemed like just another casual introduction in Hollywood's social scene, but for both of them, it sparked something much larger. What followed was not a slow courtship, but a whirlwind that drew Melanie in before she was old enough to understand the consequences. To many, it was magnetic, an irresistible pairing of charisma and rebellion. But for others, it was scandalous, raising questions about the vast age gap and the power dynamics at play. Melanie, however, was smitten. In her eyes, this was not a reckless infatuation. It was the beginning of what she believed to be her great love, one that would cast a shadow over nearly every other relationship in her life. By the time she was 15, Melanie had moved into Johnson's home, a decision that shocked even the most permissive observers of the 1970s. It was a decade known for breaking boundaries, but this still crossed a line for many. Friends and family expressed concern, and her mother, Tippi Hedren, openly admitted she feared for her daughter's future. Yet Melanie was determined, convinced that Johnson was her destiny. Johnson himself would later admit that he was captivated by Melanie's youthful spirit, her beauty, and her bold defiance of expectations. He described her as magnetic, unpredictable, and impossible to resist. Even in those early days, however, cracks were visible beneath the surface. Their relationship was built less on steady trust and more on raw passion and impulsive choices. Melanie was still a teenager, still forming her identity, while Johnson was chasing a career in a brutal industry that devoured both time and emotions. The combination created a kind of storm, one that felt exciting in the moment, but carried the seeds of inevitable destruction. Their first marriage came in 1976, when Melanie turned 18. To many, it looked like the logical next step in a fiery love affair. In reality, it was a leap into chaos. The marriage lasted just 6 months before it collapsed, under the weight of immaturity and instability. Johnson would later call it a storm they were unprepared to weather, while Melanie herself admitted she was so young and dumb, swept away by feelings she could not fully control. The turbulence of their union was obvious to everyone around them. Too much passion, too much partying, and not nearly enough grounding to sustain a lifelong bond. Yet the fire between them never truly went out. Even after their divorce, they continued circling back to one another in ways that puzzled outsiders but made perfect sense to them. Melanie would measure every other relationship against Johnson, while Johnson admitted she had left an indelible mark on his life. She was the woman who defined his youth, for better or worse, and he was the man who set her on a path of highs and lows she would never entirely escape. Their beginnings were not a fairy tale. They were messy, intoxicating, and dangerous. And yet, those beginnings were powerful enough to keep pulling them together across decades. It was in that crucible of passion and recklessness that the seeds of regret and revelation were planted. Seeds that Don Johnson would only acknowledge publicly decades later, when time and age finally stripped away the glamour. But if their early years were defined by impulsive choices and scandalous headlines, what followed would prove far more testing. Fame, fortune, addiction, and betrayal were waiting for them just around the corner, and those forces would either bind them closer together or tear them apart for good. After their brief first marriage unraveled, many assumed Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith were finished for good. The split seemed final at the time. Two young, impulsive stars who had burned bright and flamed out just as quickly. But their story was far from over. As the late 1970s gave way to the 80s, both of their careers began to climb, though in very different directions. Johnson, after years of struggling for recognition, landed the role that would change his life, Sonny Crockett, on Miami Vice. Overnight, he became a household name, the face of a cultural phenomenon that defined an era with its pastel suits, Ferraris, and pulsing soundtracks. He embodied a kind of cool confidence that millions admired, and for a while, it seemed as if he had finally outrun the turbulence of his past. Melanie, meanwhile, was finding her own footing in the film industry. Though she had grown up in the shadow of her mother, she refused to let that legacy define her. By the mid-80s, she was carving out roles that showcased her unique blend of vulnerability and strength. Audiences saw her not just as the daughter of Tippi Hedren, but as a magnetic actress in her own right. Films like Something Wild and later Working Girl would propel her to the top of Hollywood's leading ladies. To the public eye, Johnson and Griffith were both thriving, their careers taking off in spectacular fashion. But behind the magazine covers, award ceremonies, and red carpets, both were privately crumbling under the weight of their personal demons. Drugs and alcohol were not just occasional vices, they were constants. Johnson and Griffith have both openly acknowledged their struggles with addiction, and those struggles bled into every part of their relationship. Hollywood in the 80s was a place of endless temptation, where indulgence was often mistaken for normalcy. They were drawn to the highs, the parties, the late nights, the sense of escape that fame offered. But those highs almost always gave way to devastating lows. Melanie cycled in and out of rehabilitation centers, fighting for sobriety, but often pulled back into destructive patterns. Johnson, for his part, admitted later in life that he lived recklessly during those years, as if the consequences were always a problem for tomorrow. And yet, against all odds, they found their way back to each other once more. In 1989, more than a decade after their first failed marriage, Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith walked down the aisle again. This time, the world paid attention. Johnson was one of the most recognizable faces on television, and Melanie had just captured critical acclaim for Working Girl, a performance that earned her a Golden Globe and an Academy Award nomination. Together, they seemed unstoppable, the glamorous couple reborn. That same year, they welcomed their daughter, Dakota Johnson, whose arrival gave their fans a reason to believe in their fairy tale all over again. To the public, it looked like redemption. Two stars who had finally matured, conquered their demons, and found their way back to each other. But the truth was more complicated. The cracks from their past had never truly healed, and addiction remained an ever-present force corroding their bond. They loved each other fiercely, but that love was often entangled with chaos. For Melanie, Johnson represented passion, danger, and a sense of belonging she could not replicate elsewhere. For Johnson, Melanie was the one woman who could match his intensity and push back against his ego in ways few others dared. At their best, they inspired one another, fought for each other, and created moments of genuine intimacy that neither would forget. At their worst, they became each other's mirror, reflecting the flaws and wounds they both tried so hard to bury. Their second marriage, like the first, burned bright and fast. By the early 1990s, the old patterns had resurfaced, dragging them toward another collapse. Fame, addiction, and emotional turbulence were forces too strong to ignore, and no amount of love could fully shield them from the storms they created. What looked like a fairy tale reborn soon unraveled once again, leaving scars that would take decades to process. And though their marriage would not survive, the pain of those years planted the seeds of a truth Don Johnson would only dare to admit later in life. A truth that reshaped how the world saw their romance. While the public followed Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith's story through tabloid headlines and glossy interviews, there were always whispers of what was happening behind the scenes, things that neither of them confirmed at the time. Hollywood has always thrived on speculation, and for this couple, the rumors seemed endless. Friends close to them spoke of explosive arguments, of separations that happened quietly before the public ever knew, and of betrayals that neither side wanted to acknowledge. Infidelity was a word often attached to their relationship, though rarely with proof. Instead, the speculation itself became part of their legend, the idea that love and loyalty were constantly battling against temptation and personal demons. Melanie's struggles with substance abuse were widely documented, but what was less reported at the time was how much Johnson's own habits mirrored hers. Insiders have claimed that both were caught in a cycle of enabling each other's worst instincts, only to crash back down together. This created a relationship that was less about stability and more about surviving from one storm to the next. Their second marriage, though it looked glamorous from the outside, was said to be riddled with late-night fights, periods of silence, and growing resentment. Another shadow hanging over their union was Melanie's health. Decades later, she would face repeated battles with skin cancer, enduring surgeries and ongoing medical treatments. Even after her diagnoses, she continued to smoke heavily, which worried those closest to her. Some have wondered if her health scares were part of the truth Johnson could not ignore. The realization that the woman he had loved and lost repeatedly was putting herself in danger even after everything they had survived together. These were not just the troubles of a Hollywood marriage. They were matters of life, mortality, and heartbreak. The most painful speculation, however, has always circled back to what Johnson himself kept hidden. Did he walk away because the passion had burned out? Or was there something darker beneath the surface? Friends of the couple hinted that Johnson carried guilt over the way things ended, and that guilt followed him long after the divorce papers were signed. Melanie, for her part, was open about her mistakes. She admitted her addictions, her reckless choices, and her regrets. Johnson, however, was far quieter, until much later in life, when he finally allowed a devastating piece of truth to slip out. And that revelation, when it came, stunned fans who thought they already knew the whole story. When Don Johnson turned 75, he startled longtime fans by speaking with a candor that had rarely surfaced throughout his career. For years, Johnson had been the master of charm, the man who dodged difficult questions with quick wit and easy smiles. Whenever the subject of his marriages arose, he deflected with jokes, anecdotes, or by steering the conversation back to his work. But as he reflected on the past with the distance of age, he finally admitted something that many had suspected all along. His relationship with Melanie Griffith was built on passion and intensity, but never on a foundation sturdy enough to last. The devastation of his admission lay not in acknowledging that their love had failed, but in the painful clarity with which he described his own role in breaking her heart. For the first time, Johnson removed the veil of glamour and confessed that he had been incapable of giving Melanie the stability she needed. He revealed that, though he loved her deeply, his addictions, his ego, and his restless nature made him unfit for the role of husband and partner. "I was too selfish," he admitted in one interview, explaining that he chased the thrill of fame, the temptations of excess, and the spotlight of Hollywood when what she needed was consistency, devotion, and care. It was a blunt acknowledgement of guilt, and it stood in stark contrast to how Melanie had so often described him, as the one man she could never fully let go of, even after their marriages collapsed. For Johnson to concede that he knowingly failed her cast their entire romance in a new, far more painful light. What made the confession even more heartbreaking was its timing. At 75, Johnson was no longer the golden boy of Miami Vice, but a reflective elder statesman of Hollywood. He was watching Melanie continue her own battles, facing repeated health scares, enduring surgeries for skin cancer, and struggling to quit smoking despite warnings and visible scars. Her resilience had become part of her story, but so had the risks she continued to take with her well-being. Johnson's words suggested he carried the weight of knowing he had not been by her side in the ways that mattered most, that he had left her to fight too many of those battles alone. Fans who once idolized them as a glamorous couple suddenly saw the cost behind the curtain, the toll of fame, addiction, and personal weakness on two people who once believed they could conquer anything together. In many ways, his confession humanized him. The Hollywood playboy, who had once defined an era with fast cars, designer suits, and wild nights, was now stripped of that image, standing instead as a man filled with regret. By finally admitting his faults, Johnson showed a vulnerability that his younger self never could. The devastating truth was not just that he had hurt Melanie, it was that he had always known it and carried the burden of that knowledge for decades, only finding the courage to speak it aloud in his twilight years. But his honesty, though sobering, did not come without questions. Why did he wait so long to say it? What did Melanie herself think when she heard his admission? And what did it mean for the bond they still shared through their daughter, Dakota? A bond that kept them tied together long after their romantic love had burned away. Don Johnson's confession at 75 did not go unnoticed. Fans who had followed his and Melanie Griffith's story for decades reacted with a mix of shock, sadness, and respect. Some applauded him for finally being transparent about the destructive choices he had made during their marriage. Others were struck by how long it had taken him to acknowledge what Melanie herself had spoken about openly for years. For many, his admission confirmed that behind the glitz of Hollywood's most talked-about romances, there had always been deep fractures that fame could not disguise. As for Melanie, there was no explosive response. She did not issue dramatic public statements or take to the press with retaliation. That silence, in its own way, spoke volumes. Over the years, she has described Johnson as a defining figure in her life, even while acknowledging the chaos of their time together. Her focus has shifted toward her children, particularly Dakota Johnson, who has carved out her own path in Hollywood, and toward her health, which has remained a point of concern. Whether or not she felt vindicated by Johnson's words, she carried herself with the same resilience that has defined her later years. The revelation also forced many to reconsider the family dynamics at play. Their daughter Dakota has often spoken of her gratitude for having two parents who, despite their problems, always loved her and supported her career. Johnson's confession reframed that narrative, suggesting that his sense of guilt may have influenced how protective and supportive he has been of Dakota as an adult. The acknowledgement of his failures with Melanie could explain why he has taken such care to remain a steady presence in his daughter's life. Publicly, Johnson's reputation softened. The man once known as the reckless playboy of Miami Vice fame was now seen as a 75-year-old reflecting on his mistakes. His honesty gave depth to a story that might otherwise have been dismissed as just another Hollywood breakup. For fans, it was a reminder that even celebrities, with all their success and glamour, are not immune to regret and heartbreak. But his confession did more than just shift public perception. It reopened a conversation about what it truly means to love someone in the spotlight. If Johnson had admitted his selfishness earlier, could the outcome have been different? Or were the forces pulling them apart? Addiction, ambition, fame, too powerful to ever overcome? The answers to those questions remain uncertain, but Johnson's words left one thing clear. The truth, however painful, was long overdue. Looking back, the story of Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith is less about glamour and more about the complexity of human love. They met when Melanie was barely a teenager, and Don was already carving out his Hollywood ambitions, and from the very beginning, their bond was marked by extremes. Passion and chaos lived side by side. Addiction and fame amplified every weakness, and through it all, they never truly managed to break free from one another until the weight of their mistakes became impossible to carry. Johnson's confession at 75 stripped away the romanticized veneer that tabloids had sold for years. It was not simply about love lost, it was about accountability. For the first time, he admitted that he had failed to give Melanie the security she deserved, that his selfishness had cost them both the chance at something lasting. For fans who grew up idolizing them as Hollywood royalty, the revelation was devastating, yet it also made their story feel undeniably real. It showed that love, no matter how powerful, can be undone by choices made in the heat of youth and the glare of fame. As Melanie continues to battle her health issues and focus on her family, and as Johnson moves forward as a reflective elder statesman of Hollywood, their relationship remains a symbol of what happens when two people are bound together by passion but torn apart by circumstance. The devastating truth Johnson finally shared does not erase their history. It reframes it, and it leaves us with a haunting question. Was their love ever strong enough to survive? Or was it always destined to end the way it did? What do you think? Was Johnson right to wait so long to reveal the truth? Or should he have said it decades earlier when it might have mattered more? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed uncovering the hidden story behind Hollywood's most talked about romances, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one.